עכשיו אנחנו נצפה בסרטון מצולם שעשתה סגנית עורך הארץ, גברת נועה לנדאו, עם המנכ"לית של האגודה לזכויות האזרח בהונגריה, מדינה שכידוע עברה כבר תהליכים שאנחנו עלולים לעבור אותם.
Hi, Stefania.
Hi, very nice to be here.
So we are here with Stefania Kapunsai, I hope I pronounce this right, who is the Executive Director of the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, the HCLU, and the co-chair of the International Network of Civil Liberties Organizations. And Stefania, thank you so much for being here and agreeing to speak with us. I don't know if you've been following a lot the news in Israel lately, but Hungary is a lot on the news in Israel. Hungary is definitely a country that has been compared a lot to Israel regarding the recent so-called reforms that this far-right government is proposing, and especially we are in a conference, this will be broadcasted in a conference that's dealing with the so-called reform in the judicial system. So this is the issue that we're mainly concerned about. So maybe you can tell us a little bit what exactly happened in Hungary and what are the implications, how it affected life in the country since, and basically tell us our future if it's that similar.
Thank you so much for the questions and for inviting me. So I'm not sure I'm confident enough to tell you your future, but I certainly see similarities between the playbooks that were played in Hungary and now are playing in Israel. And I think it's also, we can say that there are many similarities between governments that are trying to restrict democratic freedoms. We can even say that they are using the same playbook, which is bad news in a certain sense, but also it also provides us an opportunity to learn from each other and really utilize the lessons from other governments, from other countries. You were asking me about how it started in Hungary, and it all started with the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court used to be a slow but relatively reliable check on the states and the government's power in Hungary. So one of the first actions of the government that now is in its fourth term, so they are in power since 2010. So one of their first action was to increase the number of justices and then fill the bench with people, with justices who are loyal to the government, who are either ideologically agree with them or politically loyal to the government. Of course, there are still justices that have a professional track record that would qualify them for the bench, but we can safely say that in the past 12 years, the Constitutional Court failed at many points to really provide a check on government's power, and many of its decisions really served the political interest of the government. So the Constitutional Court was the first, but we also have to mention that soon, already in 2011-12, a new constitution was adopted. Besides the Constitutional Court and adopting a new constitution, the government in the first term was also really focusing on taking over independent institutions. Independent institutions such as authorities that should be check on the government's power, for example, for data protection. And by taking over, I mean sometimes really changing the scope and reorganizing these institutions, but most importantly, appointing people to be the head of these institutions who are politically loyal to the government. So what happened since then is that oftentimes these institutions, now even the fundamental rights ombudsperson, doesn't pursue cases which are sensitive to the government, doesn't issue opinions, legal opinions that could harm somehow the government's political interest. Instead of this, they are oftentimes dealing with minor issues or issues that concern more like private actors. This is true for human rights institutions, but also, for example, the authority that's supposed to ensure that there is competition. So the competition authority as well.
So what did you see on the ground that actually was immediately affected by these judiciary legal changes? Can you give us some examples to specific civil liberties that were jeopardized because of these changes?
So it took a while until you could really feel the impact of this, because oftentimes there were still, for example, legal clerks in the independent institutions that were really moving things forward within the institution. And also there were a few measures that were instated regarding the regular courts in Hungary, but they only started to show their impact in the 5 years significantly. So it took a while before we could really see it as it plays out. But just to give you an example concerning the last elections, 2 examples actually. One example concerns how the political power of the government is really used in an election campaign. And the other one concerns the rights of LGBTQ people in Hungary. So there was the pandemic, and in Hungary you had to register on a website in order to be registered for vaccination, and you have to give your consent so that the government can contact you on that email address. And this email address, this pool of email addresses were used during the election campaign to disseminate information that supported the governing party's political campaign. So it was no longer about public health, it was about who is elected in the country. And there were many complaints about this. We represented some of these complainants and we took them to the court. And I think it's a very clear case in which state resources are used for the interest of one of the political parties, and still the High Court didn't find any issue with that, and it also went to the Constitutional Court, and no problem. They gave their stamp to this practice. And the other case that I wanted to mention is at the same time with the election, we had also a referendum, an anti-LGBT referendum, and many civil society organizations campaigned during the campaign to cast an invalid vote. And after the campaign closed, and actually this referendum was invalidated, so we were successful. Many of us received fines from the National Election Commission for our campaign, saying that it is not lawful to campaign for casting an invalid vote. And all of us took this fine to the courts, and even though we coordinated and submitted basically similar legal arguments, it really depended on the judicial group who decided what the decision was. So where you could already see that through changing the ways in which judges are appointed, that already played out. They issued a ruling that was favorable to the government's interests, so the fine was held up. And in other cases where a different, really independent judge decided on the case, the fine was so we didn't have to pay the fine.
So, Stefania, what do you regret not having done from the beginning? You know, in Israel, we have now a very pretty emotional debate on whether one side should compromise with the other, or should we, you know, not give up and use every possible democratic ways that we have to object these changes before they take place. What do you think? Is there anything that you should have done before all this happened differently?
Mm-hmm. So I think definitely don't give up the fight. There is a compilation of advice from Timothy Snyder, who is an American historian that is directed towards people living in authoritarian countries and states. And one of the first advice is not to give up institutions. And I think that's really crucial. That's really important. I do believe that even if there are only small wins, that small wins can prove very important in the long run. They might mean that you win a case for a client who is really vulnerable, or it can mean that through that small win, you can really challenge the whole system. You can never know what these small wins are good for in the long run. Having said that, one of the regrets that I have is that at the very beginning, when we were really opposing these changes, we took some demonstrative actions that really highlighted our opinion, and we didn't pay enough attention with keeping some contacts with the government and within the government. It's not to say that we shouldn't oppose or we should tone down our opposition. It's to say that it is important to, as much as possible, trying to keep up the channels of communication. It might, again, it's similar to the small wins. You never know what it will be good for. And for example, there are still journalists who have contacts in Hungary within the government, and they are able to report based on those contacts. So it can be really important. And one of my lessons or regrets, if you want to frame it that way, is really stemming from before this government was elected. It's more about the 1990s or the early 2000s, when I started my career as a human rights defender in 2005. And back then, when the government was more receptive to human rights arguments and democratic principles, we didn't pay enough attention about convincing people, convincing citizens. And we didn't pay enough attention on how to demonstrate to citizens that these principles and human rights are actually directly impacting their life, and how is it directly relevant to their life. And I think this was a crucial mistake that now we are trying to right. Because I think for these type of governments, really, people's power is really key. They are really using how many people voted for them for their legitimacy, and they are really receptive of the word of the street, if you will. And I think it's really important to not only be engaged in this elite and sometimes really high-level discussions, but also making sure that the citizens of the country, or at least some of them, or most of them, or groups of them, understand why is it relevant for them and how it directly impacts their life.
What do you think, Stefania, is the international community's responsibility? We see that, for example, now in Budapest, we see a lot of Israelis from the conservative right-wing part of politics, getting ideas, inspiration, and help from fellow conservatives in Hungary. How much do you think these global connections of anti-globalists are key in this process, and what can we do, liberals, to counter that?
Mm-hmm. So I think national and international strategy should go hand in hand. I think the international community has an impact and has a responsibility in all this. Similarly, as these anti-right groups learn from each other, we can also learn from each other's mistakes, and really not start the learning process from the beginning, but utilize what other groups already experienced. So I think these kind of conversations that you organize are really important and key, because we can share our experience, and that's why I agreed, and I'm really happy to do that, because when we first started to experience this democratic backsliding, and also how it impacted civil society organizations, the anti-NGO rhetoric, we benefited a lot from our contacts with organizations in similar countries. So we learned a lot from our Russian counterparts, Russian human rights organizations, but also other human rights organizations as well. And the international groups, or the groups working in other countries, were really helpful in that way. So I think really sharing our notes is really important, but also equally important to listen to each other, to listen to the people who are in that situation and what they deem as useful. Sometimes, press statements are useful, but more often our so-called silent diplomacy can be more useful. So, for example, contacting the embassy of the certain country in your own country, or other ways of raising the issue to the public discourse. So I think we definitely need to talk to each other, and the international response is important. What you see in Hungary now is that the European Union is finally really stepping up and really making sure that the government, at least in some fields, at least on some topics, are backtracking the really anti-democratic measures. At the same time, I think national discourse is also very important to focus on, and again, I want to stress the importance of making sure that the citizens are also talked to about your position.
So I have a personal question for my last question, which is how not to lose hope. How do you stay optimistic in the struggle? I mean, I assume it's not easy to have your position right now in Hungary. So how do we continue without despair?
I think we have to accept that despair sometimes comes. So it's not, like linear, that the hope is not constantly the same. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. I personally get my hope and my energy from two sources. One is our clients, who are really important to us and who oftentimes express that finally in their life, for the first time, someone is taking them seriously. And even if we don't win their case, they are just so glad that someone is taking them seriously and taking up their case. So that is really important. And especially in many of these cases, we can at least a little bit help on their situation. And the other one is the human rights community. My community at the Hungarian Civil Liberties Union, my colleagues here, but also the more broader human rights community within the country and the international one. We lift each other's up. And if someone is, like on this hope roller coaster is down, then maybe others can help lift them up.
Thank you so much, Stefania. Is there anything else you want to maybe tell the people in the audience tonight?
No, I think I told everyone, and I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really happy to share my experience. I'm not so happy that you are in this situation, but I'm pretty certain that we will overcome, and the human rights movement will prevail.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.